rolling start. I guess I'll start this way. Greetings from Oslo, Norway, which is where I'm coming to you at the moment. And that's why this first workshop is by Zoom. I will be in person for the next two workshops on campus starting in 2 weeks. More about that in a moment. The background is when I returned to SPP a year ago, I was delighted to find a lot of student interest in energy and environmental topics. Much more so than in years past when interest seemed to be somewhat more limited, but now there's a real critical mass of students interested in it, and a number of students saying that they think they might want to do a capstone project for their second year in the field. And so with that, in discussions with Dean Peterson, we decided, well, maybe we ought to try and build out the program with an energy lab concept. That's the new thing, especially in the graduate level education, where you want to be collaborative, intensive. My idea of a workshop usually is where people present their preliminary ideas, research progress, and share it with the classes and with other students. And then you bat it around and talk about what questions need to be answered and where it might go from there. And in other words, students help each other. And the faculty help the students develop their ideas and make them into first-class projects. But the course I'm going to teach in the spring on energy and environment, although it'll be pitched to capstone students, is open to anyone who's interested. You don't have to necessarily even be a second-year student if there's room in the class. So everyone's welcome if they're interested in the subject. I'll add that we have succeeded in raising a couple of grants for the project so that we can bring in some guest speakers. I'm hoping, among others, to have perhaps the chairman of the California Public Utilities Commission, Matt Baker, recently appointed to that position by Governor Newsom. And I've known Matt for, 10 years or more, and he's a very interesting guy and very knowledgeable. And I'll have a few things to say tonight about California's electricity scene, which is something that students should know generally about, and maybe one or two want to learn a lot about, and I hope so. These workshops, secondly, are meant to complement the workshops Professor Marlon Graff does this fall, which is a general overview of research techniques and tools for students in developing and pursuing their capstone subjects, whatever they are. And let's see, what else should I say about this? And we'll be previewing a little bit what will happen in the spring course, but there's going to be so much to it that even with the 3 workshops, we're barely going to scratch the surface of what will be covered in the classroom over the course of a semester. So the arc of these 3 workshops will go as follows. Today, I'm going to confine myself mostly to just energy. And energy is not a simple subject, although the discourse about it is often extremely simplistic. From the media, from political advocates, politicians, they say the media malpractice in energy is one of the worst of any subject around. And then the next 2 workshops when I'm present on campus is the second workshop will get into data sources on energy and how to use them. And I'll go through those in 2 weeks. Even more so when we get into class in January. But energy is a very data-driven field. You really need to know the numbers of how different things work. And trends over time are very important too. And the third workshop will be on the basics of environmental law and environmental policy, and also the data sources. Environment is also, or should be, a data-driven subject as well. There's some huge gaps in our data, but we have some very good data on a lot of areas, and I will go through where these data sets can be accessed, how to use them, and it's gotten a lot easier over the years. When I first started doing environmental data analysis, gosh, more than 30 years ago now, I had to do it the old-fashioned way and go to the EPA libraries and look up their big, thick reports on different kinds of pollution and so forth, and read tables and the appendices. Now everything is online. You can download endless sets in Excel spreadsheet format, and so it makes it very easy to acquire and then analyze on your own. So I'll go through a lot of that over the next 3 weeks. And the point of all this and the point of the course is to develop your own powerful analytical tools to do serious, original work either as part of a capstone project or just generally if you're interested in the field or end up going into some aspect of the energy and environment field as you launch your professional career. Or in other words, as I like to say, I like to create energy ninjas. And so what I want to do is, let's see if I can find it there. Here we go. I do have some slides I'm going to go through. And some of the ones today will give you some aspects of the framework for understanding all this. Some of it will be some slides. This is a subject that lends itself to data presentation. I try to keep them simple. You can make them very complicated, and we will in the fullness of time. But I'm going to start today with some simple ideas and a few things to stimulate your thought. And don't worry about getting either confused today or puzzled. I'm going to throw a lot at you, almost fire hose style. And I'm not going to give a quiz or anything like that. And these are the kind of things we'll work through more patiently in class so you get a really deeper understanding of them. But I started by saying that an awful lot of public sentiment, you might say, about environment is superficial. I like to joke sometimes that people think energy comes from the wall socket that you plug your coffee maker into. Or you will see, let's see how I go here. We'll see a slogan like this: who needs oil? I ride the bus. Well, what does the bus run on? Now, it's true. Right now, we're trying to move to electric buses and so forth. And we'll see how that goes. But this is typical of sometimes the discussions that you see. Or one of my favorites is, if you start learning about the electricity market, boy, is it complicated. We are used to paying, I think in California now, we're up to 25 cents a kilowatt hour on average. But in fact, the cost of generating energy and distributing it varies widely throughout a single day. It can go from very cheap and almost, believe it or not, negative prices. And you might wonder, how can you have negative prices for electricity for the generators like PG&E and Southern California Edison? But it does happen. And I'll show you an example of why and how a little bit. Other times, the power companies have to pay, 50, 60 cents or $1 for a kilowatt to deliver to you, but they charge you the same price pretty much. So it makes the economics of it for the utilities somewhat unstable. And so it's a complicated world, and unraveling how that works is really an important thing to understand. And, these days, if you follow news, a lot of people think if just protest oil drilling and block highways and say just stop oil will solve the problem, really doesn't do much of anything. Or you get, as I like to put it, false correlations. This one's one of my favorites. Is you can see oil field production, and this, by the way, this has all changed. I don't know about rock music quality, but U.S. oil production has changed dramatically since 2007, and that'll be a thing to be talked about too. Let's see what else I've got here. So what is energy? We kind of take it for granted, and in fact, you need to make a distinction starting out between energy and power. In other words, energy, rightly understood, is the power to do work. So let me give you a simple example. Suppose you decide you want to push on a really large boulder, and you lift weights and you eat a lot of protein in the morning, and you get up and you start huffing and puffing and pushing on the boulder. You'll use a lot of your own personal energy, right? Just, all that energy you're exerting. But how far do you move that boulder? You don't move it anywhere at all. So you've used a lot of energy, but you haven't actually accomplished any work. You haven't made anything moved. You haven't, made a light go on and so forth. So that's wasted energy. And you might say, to put it in terms of energy efficiency, that the energy efficiency of your effort to move that boulder is 0. Now, if you're Superman, your energy efficiency would be close to 100%, right? Because Superman just kicks the boulder and it flies off into space. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that is the range of energy use. I'll show you in a few minutes how some energy conversion technologies we use are only 10% efficient, and others are close to 100% efficient. And understanding that range of things and why and how and so forth is also an important part of the energy story. Um, and so the point is that a lot of times we think, to use another example, what is energy? Well, people will say, quite reasonably, well, I mean, oil and coal and natural gas and solar panels and what, batteries, and all those answers are, broadly speaking, correct, but not precisely correct. The reason I say that is they are stores of potential energy. In other words, a barrel of oil is useless until you figure out a way to refine it, put it into some kind of machine, an automobile engine or something like that, to generate power to move a car, to drive a turbine, and so forth. And we'll get into the reasons why we have, for 150 years or longer, favored fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas in particular, to generate roughly 80% of our energy in the modern world. They turn out to be very, very good stores of energy, and I'll give you a couple of reasons why as we go forward. And I talk about coal, oil, and gas as being stores of energy, but there are other kinds of energy. Maybe the best example of kinetic energy, we think of kinetics as things moving. You think of water in a lake behind a dam, and the water runs downhill. And when water runs downhill, it can turn a turbine. That's kinetic energy. There's no dam there, and the water just spills over a cliff like, say, Yosemite Falls. No energy is generated. You lose a lot of potential energy. In other words, a whole lot of water up at a high altitude has a lot of potential energy if you put it behind a dam. Similar things can be done. There's ideas of trying to, we do have in California one significant pumped storage facility. Pumped storage means you let the water run out during the day through a dam when you need a lot of electricity. And then maybe overnight, when electricity demand is low, but you're still generating plenty of it, you pump the water back up the hill into the lake. And our biggest facility is actually, I think it's Castaic Lake on Highway 5, just north of Santa Clarita Valley there, which I'm sure many of you have driven by. And maybe, as I always used to wonder, why on all these hot summers in the middle of a drought does that lake never seem to go down? Well, that's because we keep filling it up most of the time. And it's our one pump storage facility in California that's kind of interesting. The other thing about energy is we measure it in so many different ways. And we use it in different ways. One of the mistakes about energy is we like to talk about just energy as one thing, but in fact, we use energy predominantly in two forms. We use energy in sort of liquid or stored form for transportation, right? We have diesel and gasoline for cars and trucks and trains and jet fuel. And that form of energy, and that can be stored, right? If you put 10 gallons of gasoline in your car, you can park your car for a week and not drive anywhere, and you still have 10 gallons of gasoline and the potential energy in each gallon of gasoline available to you. That is mostly not true for electricity. We consume electricity as it is produced in real time. The electrons you get through the wires into your house have to be generated at the instant that you need it, since it travels the speed of light over the wires. It is difficult to store electricity. Now, of course, you'll say batteries, and that's correct, but that's a large subject that I'll come to a little bit more in a moment. The batteries, I'll just hold that for now. The battery story is a very important one, but there are some inherent limitations to batteries that need to be understood before we get to the question of whether they're going to work on as large a scale as we need. The other thing is we measure energy in so many different ways. My favorite here, and I have this actually out of order. My favorite measure is the BTU, which is the British thermal unit. And I always like to joke that a British thermal unit is not an underwear line for Calvin Klein. A British thermal unit is the amount of energy necessary to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree. So here, think about the tea kettle on your stovetop when you're making tea in the morning. And if you're making 3 or 4 cups for yourself and your family or whatever, your friends, you probably have 1 pound of water. And what does it take you? It may take you on your stove, 8 minutes or whatever it takes to boil it. I don't know I forget what the BTUs are to raise the water from, say, 60 degrees out of the tap to 200 degrees for tea. But that's one way of understanding how a BTU works. The United States and a lot of international energy agencies like to measure energy use in BTUs. So maybe it takes, I'll just make up a number here. Maybe it takes 50 BTUs to heat up your tea in the morning. The United States uses about 95 quadrillion BTUs a year. 95 quadrillion is 2 orders of zeros past trillion, I think. I'll have to look at that again. So it's a lot. But we use some of that as electricity. We use some of it as liquid fuels in our cars. And so it's kind of a crude measurement. It's one way of saying total energy consumption, but it's not very helpful when we're trying to answer questions such as energy efficiency, pollution coefficients from coal and natural gas, let alone nuclear power, and how to change our electrical mix to meet our various policy goals. And then, so we have watts. That's a standard measure of electricity, but it can also be used as a as a measure of the force needed to move objects. One of my favorites is I don't know how many of you are watchers of Top Gear or what we used to call when I was younger a motorhead. How do we measure the power output of cars? Still, if you go into a dealer and you're looking at a car, what's the power of this car? Anybody know? By the way, I meant to say that if anybody has a question along the way or a comment, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask a question for clarification or something if you want. But this is kind of quaint because we still measure the power output of cars in horsepower. Now, I shouldn't laugh about this. I find it kind of amusing today when we have all these technical measures like, watts and joules and so forth, that we measure the power of cars in horsepower. But why horsepower? So what is a horsepower? 1 horsepower is 550 foot-pounds per second. Or if you want to convert it to watts, it's 746 watts. So that sounds a little odd because you're used to a 75-watt light bulb, and you're saying 10 light bulbs could move 550 feet. An object 550, 1 pound by 550 feet. It's not quite right. The kilowatts your light bulbs are actually divided by 100. In the way these things are done for consumer use. And so then it's one of these technical details that's important to understand and master in the fullness of time. But back to the horse. There's a reason why we started using horses as the first major energy improvement in human existence. It takes almost 100 human beings to do the same amount of power as a single horse can do. So I think it's 100. I mean, I have to double check that figure and make sure it's right, but a lot of human beings. And so if you think about why agriculture flourished for humans starting 2,000-3,000 years ago with horses, because you could drag the plow with a horse across a field and plow a lot more ground than humans pulling a plow can do. Or you think of, for centuries, horses were the primary mode of power for transportation. They hauled horses and carriages and pretty large trucks. And the drawn vehicle, and I've got great data on this, I'll show you when we get to the environment section for that matter, when we get to the environmental workshop. Horse-drawn vehicles were still the predominant mode of urban commercial transport for goods and services and large items in major cities. I think in New York the figure was there were 50,000 horses at least used primarily just to haul around trucks and carriages and things around town. And I will say for now the amount of manure that produced and the environmental problem it posed for places like New York and Chicago and so forth. And that's not much more than 100 years ago that was the case. So horsepower, that's I did a calculation once, by the way. I believe the calculation I came up with was it takes 280,000 horsepower to get a 747 aloft, a 747 aircraft. Now you couldn't actually put 280,000 horses in front of a 747 and get it aloft because you couldn't reach the speed you need. But the speed and acceleration is an added dimension that's important. But just as a way of converting the kind of intensity of power that modern technology can do, and things like jet airplanes will tell you a lot. So there you go. There's my British thermal unit. Quadrillion BTUs. That's 8 billion gallons of gasoline. We only use a couple 100 million gallons of gasoline, I think is the figure in the US these days. Some of the international agencies that try to do energy statistics for the whole world, instead of using BTUs, they like to use this first one here, MTOE, million tons of oil equivalent. And that's not bad. Again, reducing energy use to a common denominator is a useful way of understanding a lot of trends and so forth. But it also has its defects like BTUs do. Now, since we're a policy school, one of the things we want to think about from the beginning is what are the objects of energy policy? And so I've got 6 here I throw out, but if anybody wants to think of some others, please feel free to suggest them. So first of all, we want it to be affordable. Expensive energy doesn't do anyone any good, and this is becoming a problem, well, for a lot of industries around the world, in Europe and in California. The Wall Street Journal recently had a report about how very high electricity prices are really causing serious distress for some small businesses in California, and you want it to be accessible. I'll show you a chart in a few minutes that as recently as 1940, which is not that long ago, that's grandparents or great-grandparents anyway, 20% of Americans did not have access yet to electricity. That's not that long ago. So, nowadays it's pretty much we have 100% access to electricity. But what was true of the United States, say 100 years ago, or even 70, 80 years ago, is true for a lot of parts of the world. I'll come to that in a moment. And you want it there, point number 2, it needs to be abundant. You need to have an adequate supply of whatever sources that you're using. Third, on our mind these days is sustainability. I mean, usually it's climate change is on our mind, but it's not the only environmental aspect of energy that has been an object of environmental concern for quite a long time. Conventional air pollution, smog in LA, for example, but also, effects of mining for coal, drilling for oil, and so forth. That's been on our mind for quite a long time, a lot longer, in fact, than climate change. Point number 4 is efficiency and conservation. I mentioned that, let's see, there's 2 or 3 ways of doing this. The general figure you will hear is that a gasoline-powered engine is only 25% energy efficient, which is to say 3/4 of the energy in is wasted energy. It's the heat that goes out the exhaust pipe or radiates out from an engine. But of course, that's not true of every gasoline model. And that's why we have miles per gallon ratings on cars, right? Smaller engines use less fuel, but go 50 miles to the gallon and so forth. So they're more energy efficient. We talk about how you can heat your home with less electricity through insulation and various other devices, heat pumps and so forth. And so the efficiency question is hugely important to understand how it works, where the gains have been made, where they might still be made, and so forth. And then conservation, we used to be worried, and one of the things we want to do is talk about policy evaluation, is to what extent all of our various iterations of energy policies have succeeded or not. Believe it or not, and this has been hard for people to believe for 50 years, at one point, as recently as the 1960s, I'll put it this way, one of the main objects of American energy policy was to keep the price of oil up. I mean, oil was so cheap and abundant in the late 50s and through the first half of the 1960s that it was unprofitable for American oil companies and a lot of competition from around the world. And the problem was you wanted a stable oil price. You didn't want fluctuations. You didn't want companies going from boom to bust. And ever since the 1970s, when the first energy crisis started, as it was called, the whole thing flipped around, because now our problem is always worrying about energy prices, especially oil, going higher, shortages. There was thought for a long time that we were going to run out of oil and gas. Now the problem under climate change is that we're not going to run out of oil and gas. And that whole story is very interesting, how that's completely flipped around in the last 30 years or so. So we have too much oil now and too much gas. It's still a very unstable market for oil. Some of that for political reasons, which you all know, but some for some other reasons that we can talk about. And that's point number 5 is energy independence. I'd like to show, and we'll show again in class, a famous reel that Jon Stewart put together in a Daily Show of every president back to Nixon saying, we're going to get off foreign oil. And that started in 1972. And here we are in 2024, and we finally have gotten off foreign oil and become the world's largest oil producer in what was a complete surprise to everybody. No one saw it coming. It's a story about technology that we'll go through in some detail. So we're now energy independent. However, oil is a global commodity, and so if the rest of the world falls apart, it will affect the price of oil and American industry and the American economy. So even though we might be oil independent in a narrow, specific sense, we're not at all immune to the problems of the global market. So energy security still remains a significant problem. And then number 6 is the reliability of the infrastructure. And so one thing we'll talk quite a lot about in the fullness of time is the energy transition that we're trying to make both here and around the world. And energy transitions are an interesting subject in themselves. We've made several, and I will show you examples of a couple in a minute. But one of the big challenges is the reliability of especially the electrical grid. Now, here's another thing we take for granted. And to make a long story short, I'll just mention here as a placeholder that a survey was taken of thousands of engineers, I think about 15 years ago, or maybe it might have been around the year 2000 now. And the question asked was, what was the most significant engineering achievement of the 20th century? And you might think, well, I don't know, the nuclear bomb, right? Or maybe other things. And the overwhelming winner in the survey was the electrical grid. And as I say, we take that for granted now, and it happened in the space of a century. And keeping the grid adequate for modern needs and balanced. The energy grid is, I don't know, it's a little like the plumbing in your house. You don't want air gaps in it that is hard on your plumbing and that doesn't deliver water or delivers it in spurts and so forth. And if you don't have the balance kept properly in your energy grid, then you start having blackouts or power surges that can be damaging to equipment and so forth. So that's a significant problem. And a lot to be learned about the electrical grid and how it works. So let's see, what have I got next? So I think there are 3 keys to beginning to understand energy in sufficient depth. The first one's what I call energy or power density. How much energy you get from a material input. You know, how much energy is in a gallon of gas or a pound of coal or a solar panel or a windmill. I'll show you an example in a moment of how that works. The second one is cost. What does it cost per unit of energy delivered? And do costs change if you can scale it up, which is point number 3. One of the things that I like to do is collect. I actually quit doing this because I could do it on a daily basis. But the most typical thing to see, even in fairly technical journals like the MIT Technology Review, is you'll see a news story and it'll say some laboratory has discovered a brand new energy source or has perfected fusion energy or has figured out how to get energy from banana peels or often very exotic things. And there's usually something missing from it, which was how much did it cost you to get 10 BTUs of energy? And so here's the point. If it costs you a lot to get a little bit of energy, it's not practical. It can't be scaled up very well at that kind of cost. And will the costs ever come down if you scale it up? So for example, we can make diesel fuel from algae. A lot of private venture capital going into trying to do that both in this country and especially in Israel. And the problem is it's hard to keep the algae in sufficient scale and alive long enough to keep reproducing and so forth. The algae dies. And so far, the best we can get is diesel for about $10 a gallon. Well, that's, what I think diesel before taxes has cost maybe $2 a gallon to make from oil. or from, you can make diesel out of, used French fry oil from fast food restaurants. We actually do that, but there's not enough leftover French fry oil to make a significant difference in the overall energy use. Still, you can see the problem there. If you can't figure out how to make algae biofuel or algae diesel for, say, $4 a gallon or $5 a gallon, it simply won't be competitive, and no one will make any money at it, and it can't be sustained. And so that leads to the third question, which is important, which is scale. So in other words, memorize these words: density, cost, scale. Density, cost, scale. If you understand all those three and have them in the forefront of your mind, you're halfway on the way to becoming a top-notch energy analyst. Now, when it comes to density, I like to illustrate it with the simple device of music storage devices. And so if you're an old timer like me, you might have started out back when dinosaurs roamed the earth in the 1970s, listening to the music on 8-track tapes. I don't know how many of you have ever seen one of these. I still have a couple stuck away in a shoebox somewhere. They're pretty big. Those are like the size of, 2 large cigarette packs. There's Dean Peterson says he remembers these too. You're not as old as me, but okay. Now, here's the point of these. They're a pretty good technology, actually, from an audiophile point of view. And your average 8-track carried about maybe an album, like 10 songs, as much as an old record, vinyl record album would carry, 10, maybe 12 songs. And by the way, this technology is kind of interesting because it was continuous play. In other words, if you put it into your 8-track player and turn it on, you never had to flip it over or anything. It had this sort of single loop to it. So it would just keep going forever. You'd get pretty tired of the album after 5 or 6 hours, but it'd keep going forever. But the point is that bit of plastic and magnetic tape, 10, 12 songs. Before long, we got the cassette tape, which was a fraction of the size, could hold more songs, but it did end. It was reel to reel. And so, when you got to the end of the tape, you had to flip it over. But lot smaller space, lot smaller footprint, could store more things. Now, I think you can guess what's coming next. You flash forward, and that was, by the way, the state of the art for music storage for a long time. You could buy record albums either in the old vinyl, or you could always buy them in the cassette release in record stores. And I think you know where we're going next, because what happened to music storage? Well, these guys came along, right? The iPod. And, the first one's the one there on the right, from back around 2000, 2001. And then they got smaller down to this one, the Nano, the size of a postage stamp. And how many songs could you store on those? Well, 1,000 in the first model. And I think beyond that, now that they're integrated into our smartphones, and the iPods don't exist anymore from Apple. I think you can still get MP3 players and many other producers. So here's the point. You went from, the 8-track tape, the cassette, the iPod, and what you now have, if you think of songs as bits of energy, you're seeing much higher concentration or higher density of music in a smaller space. And by the way, using less energy. I've never done the calculations, but I'm thinking to get the music out of the 8-track tape, out of the cassette tape, probably used more energy inputs and electricity than the iPod does. And yet we get 1,000 songs out of it if we want, or 3,000, however many it is. And so maybe you can anticipate where I'm going with this. Is I like to say that when it comes to energy density, meaning how compact the energy is for what it produces, the old 8-track tapes are a little bit like wind power. They have this advantage: they're continuous. The windmill will produce power as long as the wind keeps blowing. Leave that problem aside for the moment. Whereas the cassette tape, remember I said we got to the end of the cassette tape, you had to flip it over. Solar power is, in most cases, superior to wind power for its energy density. But the problem is the sun goes down at night. And so when the sun goes down, you get zero power out of that cassette tape. It just stops working. And then I think at the far end of the scale for electricity production, the iPod is more like nuclear power, because nuclear power is the actual amount of fuel in that powers a nuclear power plant is tiny compared to the amount of power you get from the materials that go into solar and power and wind power and so forth. By the way, it occurred to me that if someone were curious, we'll say more in a moment about nuclear power and a lot more in due course. One of the things California is trying to do right now is we want to get rid of essentially fossil fuel powered trucks. And we're trying to push the idea of electric trucks. Now, one idea, by the way, is assessing the feasibility of electric trucks, because the batteries would be very large and very heavy, take a long time to charge. And there's a lot of resistance from the truck industry saying, we don't think this is feasible at all. But here's a question. Could you make a nuclear powered long haul truck? And a lot of what's going on in nuclear power these days is trying to develop small nuclear technologies, microreactors, they're called. Bill Gates has invested several $100 million in trying to develop the idea, and other companies are talking about it. In other words, the old behemoth 2,000 megawatt plants like Diablo Canyon, the last one in California, are kind of, I won't say dinosaurs, but the thought is that the big nuclear is last century's technology, and we ought to think about smaller models. Well, could you make one small enough to run a truck? And I'll bet the answer at the end of the day is no. Not because you couldn't do it technically. You could probably design a tiny reactor the size of a diesel engine that you have today in a truck. But I think you'd find that the cost would be prohibitive. The safety problems that are, what happens to that reactor if the truck crashes into something? Probably a serious problem. I don't really know, but that could be a really interesting feasibility study as a capstone project, is the nuclear powered truck ? And go through all the things you have to figure out, cost and technology and safety problems and on and on and on and on. Because by the way, a nuclear powered truck would be like a nuclear submarine. Once you filled it up, it could run for 30 years on that 1 cube of uranium you put in it, probably, which is fairly astonishing to think about. More about that in due course. So here's a few more examples of conventional energy sources and their energy density. And I've just laid out here that, natural gas can be compressed. And so 1,000 cubic feet puts out a little over 1 million BTU, or 1 cubic foot of natural gas. And here, just think of the cubic foot you can make with your hand. Is about 1,000 BTUs. A cubic foot of coal is about 50,000 BTUs. I say about because there are different kinds of coal, and they vary in their energy content, and they vary in their pollution output too. And so that's something to talk about in due course. Cubic foot of gasoline is 33 pounds, 15,000 BTUs. Now, ethanol, of course, we're blending with our gasoline in California and most of the nation. And it's 10,000 BTUs for a cubic foot. And that's why, if you've ever noticed, the lower gas mileage in your car if you're using the 10 or 15% ethanol blends, because they have a lower energy content. And we make ethanol mostly from corn, and that opens up a whole lot of questions of its own that are quite interesting. Now, here's a few examples of, I mentioned earlier about energy efficiency, that, you pushing on a rock a boulder is 0% energy efficient. And so you can see some of the dynamics that come into play when you're trying to analyze energy usage and efficiency and conservation and so forth. And certain kinds of technologies like the electric motor in electric cars. You see the third one down here is 90% energy efficient, which means that the electricity you use from the battery goes almost all of it into power, into the wheels to drive you down the road. And that's why in the abstract, electric cars make a ton of sense. The problem is the batteries are the limiting restraint or constraint on them. More about that in due course. And so you can see, what do we got? Steam locomotive was really pretty low. Horses are pretty low because although I was talking earlier about horses were much more powerful than human beings, and the best energy device, what do you need for a whole lot of horses? You need a lot of oats. And I think the figure was as late as 1910, there were over 100 million acres of farmland in America used to grow, oats and hay and other feed for our draft animals, 100 million acres. So if you think about that for a minute, the rise of the car and the truck that starts very rapidly between 1910 and 1920 with people like Henry Ford saved a ton of farmland. And in fact, you can draw a correlation with the rise of the automobile with the reforestation of the northeastern states in the United States. I have the date on that, so I'll show you in due course, and it's a lot of fun to look at and understand. What else have I got? There's not only how much energy is in a cubic foot of uranium or a cubic foot of coal or gas and so forth. There's also the land area that it takes up. And this is a matter of considerable controversy right now as we're expanding wind and solar power so rapidly around the country. But you can see that your megawatts per year per acre. So this is not the energy source itself, although it's obviously related in the end. But you can see that, when you space out the windmills, which we have to do, you get 34 megawatts per year per acre, which is pretty low when you compare it on the other end over here to nuclear power, 57,000 megawatts a year per acre, because nuclear power plants, they may be on 50 acres or 100 acres, but a lot of solar power facilities at utility scale are on hundreds and hundreds of acres, some thousands of acres, and likewise with the wind power farms that we're putting up around the country. And then you have things in between, coal, natural gas, and so forth. And so this is a thing to think about when you want to think of it in conjunction with land conservation questions. So let's see, where do I want to go from here? I know. There's actually evidence in evolutionary biology that the human brain and certain aspects of human evolution accelerated with the beginning of our use of fire, which was the other basic energy technique that human beings perfected, many thousands of years now. And there's a correlation between the rise and command of our increasingly intensive energy sources and uses and the rise of our economy. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these charts out the last few years, the exact same line as this, except what the other charts show is population, shows world population kind of going along flat there from 3,000 years ago, and then around 1800 starting up very steeply, giving rise to the fears of the population bomb some time ago. You will also see the same line on economic growth. In other words, some very slow economic growth for hundreds and hundreds of years, nothing to get excited about. Suddenly around the year 1800, economic growth shoots off into the sky, exactly the same time scale and same dimensions as you see on this chart here. And people say, the Industrial Revolution arrives. We make steel and all the rest. And of course, what drives the Industrial Revolution is energy. Without increasingly intensive forms of energy that we could harness, none of the rest of that happens. And so to the extent that human beings can be called, and a friend of mine is a biologist says human beings really ought to be called, what's his Latin phrase? It's Latin for energy consumers. To the extent it's true that energy then becomes the master resource. I mean, I know we need water to live every day, but energy is the key to everything else. So this is one way of looking at it to show how the power use increases starting 250 years ago. Here's a different way of looking at the increase in economic growth. This is worldwide GDP per capita, and from 1800 to 2010. And you can see, and then global carbon utilization, because after all, even when we were burning wood, and we'll talk a minute about how much wood we used to burn for energy, that's still carbon-based, right? It's and it puts out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we've been heavily dependent on hydrocarbons for 80 to 90% of our energy for the last 200 plus years. And you can see that correlates with the increases in the global wealth. And in fact, you can find no example of a low energy rich country. All countries that are prosperous are energy rich. Almost all countries that are poor are energy poor countries. They're often using Well, we'll go through some of that, but people who are living on $2, $3 a day, they don't have electricity. They are burning scraps of wood they can scrape up. A lot of dung is burned still in India, which produces dreadful air pollution problems and is very low energy intensity. So it's a terrible fuel source, but that's what's being used. I like to show students these pictures. I forget which cities these are from. I think these first two are from Africa. And these are college students who are out studying at night under street lamps because they don't have electricity in their homes, but they want to study. I sort of use this as a subtle way of guilt tripping students into studying harder, right? And I shouldn't laugh about this. This is people who are really serious about their studies, and this is the links they'll go to be able to read their books because they may live a long way from the campus. The library might be closed. Who knows? Here's a couple more from, I think these are from Asia. You can find this a lot of places around the world. That's what student life is like. Let's see. Yeah, here's, I mentioned earlier about how United States, as late as 1940, 20% of Americans didn't have electricity. Here are the curves for different countries and parts of the world. And this bright dark line here, that's states, and right there's 1940, and you can see only 80% of Americans had electricity. In 1920, it was still less than 40%, which is really staggering to think of now. And you still have a lot of parts of the country where large numbers of the population still don't have access to electricity, or if they do, it's not much electricity. A lot of electricity is intermittent. In many large cities around the world, the power goes off for hours a day. Makes it hard to plan and makes it hard to run a business and so forth. So energy reliability is just as important as energy access. Here's one way of looking at the long-term way energy forms have changed over centuries. And so when we see the big one there throughout the middle, biomass fuels, well, that really means trees, burning wood, straw, and so forth. And, that's the predominant fuel source for most of human history until we find coal, starting, around 1600. And then really in the 19th century, we get oil and gas. Charcoal, of course, is really a derivative of biomass, right? It's, wood that you cook and then you can burn it at a higher temperature. It does increase the energy efficiency some, but it has tremendous pollution problems, of course. Excuse me. So a little closer look at that. Here is the United States energy use going back to 1850. And this is kind of tangled and hard to see. And by the way, I will have this PowerPoint show posted if anyone wants to go back through this at a little more leisure and stare at these things longer. I try not to, when I make my own charts, not make them quite this complicated, but sometimes you can't help it. And one of the things you see here is if you go back to 1850 and you look at this line here, the solid, I guess it's a solid gray line, we're getting 70% of our energy from burning wood. Makes sense. We're using fireplaces mostly and, fire-fueled boilers and so forth if you want to make hot water and steam. And then the dotted line, of course, is coal. And those lines cross because we start developing and using coal quite rapidly here. And so just as the car saved farmland starting around 1915, coal saved a lot of forests in America starting around the mid-19th century. And now, of course, you follow that line out, it peaks around 1920 and starts going down quite rapidly to the 1960s, and it's flat for a long time. And why is it going down? Well, one is the rise of oil. We started using more oil for energy, for transportation. We also got much more efficient in using coal. In other words, especially coal-fired power plants, but a lot of steel plants that use coal to heat their smelters and so forth. They got a lot better at using less coal for the same output of end product. So that's an efficiency story that's important. And then we see a few others. Animal feeds in here goes down. What is this light gray one? Natural gas. That more to be said about that here presently. Natural gas is a huge story. both for direct heating in your house and for generating electricity. Now, from here, I want to move on to a couple of old charts I have. I need to update these. And one of the things we'll do in class is I'll take out some old data findings and we'll update them together in real time and teach you how to do it. But this still makes the point of one of the misleading ways energy is often discussed. So this is a 22-year period that I first looked at quite a while ago. And what you see is these eye-popping numbers for wind power. Oh my goodness, a 5,000+ % increase in electricity from wind power over 22 years. Sounds great. 600% increase in solar power over the same period and 200% increase for natural gas. Well, wind power is clobbering everybody and beating the world. Anybody recognize what the potential fallacy might be here? Anybody know the fallacy? The person who drowns in a lake whose average depth is only 1.5 feet deep. Well, the lake may have an average depth of 1.5 feet, but the person drowned out in the middle of the lake where the lake is 50 feet deep, right? Same thing happens with energy. If you measure it by percent growth from a baseline, you'll get things like this. If instead you measure actual growth in power output, the numbers look like this. Over those same 22 years, the growth in kilowatts produced by natural gas was over 500 million, whereas the growth in actual output from wind power is only 117 million. In other words, we got 5 times as much new electricity output from natural gas than we did from wind. But because wind had such a low baseline of power in the late 80s, we added all that wind, and its percentage growth off a low baseline gives you that eye-popping number. This is important to keep in mind whenever you read news stories that say wind power has grown by X% or renewables have grown by Y%. And those percentages are usually accurate, but they don't tell the whole story and they don't get the baselines right. They're not comparing apples with apples in many cases. And so one of the skills to learn is how to evaluate statements like this that appear in the media, how to evaluate claims that are made by advocacy groups, by industry groups, by anybody. And that's a useful skill to have. Next, I'm going to turn briefly to electricity in California, because I do hope some people are be interested perhaps in working on some aspects of this. Like this, I shouldn't laugh. I mean, this is a serious problem for a lot of Californians suffering with high power bills. And here's some of the recent data that shows that not only is California's electricity prices twice the national average, they've been growing pretty rapidly the last 3-4 years in all 3 of the major utility areas in the state. Here's how California ranks in the world, and this may be hard for you to see depending on, especially if you're watching this on your iPhone or something. But here is the 50 states of the United States and our European peers. And you can see California comes out number 8, the 8th most expensive in the world among industrialized countries. So there's California at 29 cents per kilowatt hour in 2023. The average is 16, so almost double the average, almost double Florida. And then you can see Washington State, 11 cents per kilowatt hour. I will skip over now why Washington's power is so cheap, but that's an interesting question for someone to look into because it's a very interesting story. The whole story of California is very complicated, a long story, and I'm only going to tell a little bit of it here, and I apologize for how difficult this chart is, but here is something that'll, I think, I mainly am putting up to show you how complicated, intricate, and fascinating the California story is. This is what's known in the trade in California as the duck curve. And it's called the duck curve because if you start at the top here in 2015, you'll notice that, and this is a daily fluctuation of energy demand and supply in California. So you can see that, let's see, what time of year is this? It doesn't say, but 20 gigawatts of electricity here at midnight. And then during the day, the middle of the day, electricity demand in California actually goes down a bit because people are at work. Their TVs are off. They're not running their air conditioning if it's the summertime and so forth. And then what happens is they go home in the afternoon and they start turning on their televisions, they turn on their ovens, they start using more electricity, especially if it's hot, the air conditioning gets turned up and so forth. And evening is when peak demand happens in California. So here's a problem. If you have a lot of solar power, you get a lot of power generated in the daytime and more than you can actually use. And then the sun goes down. We're trying right now to make up the gap with batteries. But in the meantime, what we do is we use a lot of natural gas. We still import some power from other states, including, and this is controversial, some coal-generated power from Arizona and Utah. So we export our coal-fired pollution for a lot. But what's been happening is we have been installing so much wind and solar power in California that what this here is let's see, here's the important part at the bottom. Net load shown is demand minus utility scale wind and solar. And so this is really interesting because what it shows you is that as of 2023, wind and solar power was providing a surplus of total electricity needs in California for 2-3 hours a day. And that's been the goal of policy for a long time. But the problem is we haven't solved this problem of the evening peak, or going back up the curve of the duck. By the way, I like to see that. I don't know. You may say that this duck has got a distended belly. I don't know. So we still have this problem that and if the wind stops blowing, which is usually what happens when we have one of these high pressure systems that delivers a big heat wave, like y'all had in Los Angeles here, a week, 10 days ago, is been higher than these during those times. And we're working on the problem of how can you meet that high demand in the evening when you lose your solar power and your wind power is not necessarily reliable. And so that's a huge problem. Another way of looking at what's happening here is with this chart. Actually, not this one. This is a different one I thought about. Do y'all remember the eclipse back in 2018, I think? There was a couple of news stories that were quite interesting, talking about how the eclipse was actually going to diminish our solar power output to a measurable extent for the hour and a half that this moon was moving in front of the sun. Very short period of time, but still, it was a measurable difference in solar power output. So last year, you had Tropical Storm Hillary blow through, and you could see that this bubble here represents the average output from wind and solar power in California. And then the storm blew through, and just the clouds from a storm, it can also be from fires, by the way, which of course we're experiencing again, will seriously diminish the power output you get from solar power. And so remember again that you've got to keep the grid stable or you have serious blackout problems. And so you have to have a lot of backup available power in hand. And that, for the most part, has meant natural gas-fired power plants. We're not really, I won't go into that subject too much right now, except to say, it looks like we're going to have gas for a long time to come. Now, again, I say that electricity is complicated. This little chart, I think, will convey this why, right? This is a very nice way of showing you, let's see, this is a 24-hour period over 2 days last year. And you can see demand going up and down. And you can see these little color-coded areas of where we're drawing our power to meet the demand. So in the middle of the day, we're doing great with solar. And we're doing sort of okay with wind, hydro. Where's the nuclear on here? Oh, down here at the bottom, nuclear. That's Diablo Canyon. It's one power plant. It provides about 10% of our reliable electricity for the whole state. And so it's just solid on there. It almost looks like an axis. And there you'll see in the middle of the day, exports means we're making more power than we can use. And so we often give it away to other states. And in some cases, we even pay them to take it, believe it or not, which sounds perverse and probably is. But that's what our utilities and grid managers look at on a day-to-day basis, is mixing all these different sources, saying here, turn on the gas and crank it up, open up the dams a little faster, discharge the batteries, which aren't giving us very much, as you can see, giving us some. And that's a big, big challenge for the present and the future. Now, lastly, I'll talk a little bit, maybe not lastly, two or three more things maybe here. As everyone knows, the price of gasoline in California is much higher than the rest of the country and is getting wider. And if someone wants to write, I can think of 5 or 6 different capstone papers you could write on this particular issue, or maybe you want to take the issue as a whole. Why is gasoline more expensive in California? But there's several reasons for it. But one other look is, everyone likes to compare California and Florida. This is a year out of date, just about, but and gas prices are coming down again for the usual cyclical reasons, but we're a lot higher than the rest of the country. Here is one reason why, but not the only reason why, is we in California tax gasoline very highly. This is from March of 2022, and I think it's obsolete. I think we've had a new round of fuel tax increases here in the last 4 or 5 months, but it comes up to $1.30 a gallon. And I don't have the data handy on how that compares to other states, but it's on the top end of the range of how much we tax gasoline in California. But there are other reasons, including, and I think this is a terrific topic for someone to look into, is our refining requirements. California uses its own special blend of gasoline, and we do it for environmental reasons that may or may not be obsolete. That's a measure of controversy, and I will walk through that whole subject in due course in class. But we still have our own custom gasoline in California that costs more to refine and distribute. And the governor's after this right now, I think, in ways that are doubtful to be sensible, but it's a thing to look at. And then the irony is, who likes this situation? You think it's environmentalists who pushed for these clean fuel standards decades ago? Well, maybe the refiners like it because, do you want to make the same gas you make for everybody else, or do you want to make a special gas for a specialized large market that you have captive? And so I actually think there's a lot of interest in the oil refiners in keeping it this way. So another example, things might not be as simple as you think in the usual white hat, black hat world. We talk about energy and environment all the time. Talk a little bit about coal. It's already been suggested that energy is a global story, and the heart of the global story is China. And their coal use continues to go up very high. Our coal use continues to go down. So does Europe and the rest of the continent. This is one way of looking at it. Coal emissions, since what we're talking about is our primary concern about coal use is that it generates a lot of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, and so forth. And you can see that we've been going down a fair bit here in the last 20 years, while China now puts out 5 times more than we ever did. And let's see, global coal consumption looks like this. You will see that the United States is, that sort of light blue. The dark blue is the European Union. Ours is, shrinking a bit, rest of the world. And there's China and there's India. That's where the bulk of coal growth is going in the world. Or another way of looking at that story is that it doesn't look like coal use has peaked. It has in the United States and Europe, but not here. It's a story of China and India. Here, European Union going down, and much of the rest of the world is still going up. And understanding that's going to be important. And I mentioned a minute ago, oh no, I want to do this one first. So, this maybe overstates things a little bit, but the general media narrative and the general partisan narrative is Republicans are terrible on energy because they're for fossil fuels, and the Democrats are great because they want progress, they want to get rid of coal. And this chart actually needs to be updated because the pace of coal retirements under Trump were as high or higher than during Obama's 8 years. And it may have slowed under President Biden. I haven't looked at the data yet. One thing that's true is about oil drilling. So, Trump was all for drilling on federal lands. U.S. oil production on federal lands increased more under the Biden administration than it did under the Trump administration. Now, this is data through the end of last year. I think it will carry into this year based on short-term data that I have seen. And so this is, once again, an example of how the real world doesn't always go the way, the advocates talk about, the way the media presents it. It might not continue in the Harris administration because some of this story depends upon, long-term aspects of oil leasing and the permits and so forth. But still, some of the cliches you hear about, Biden's war on fossil fuels is, shall we say, less than fully accurate or doesn't really capture the full picture. Or record oil output this year in the United States. So anyway, again, the world doesn't always conform to the cliches and frameworks you often hear. This is a year out of date, year and a half out of date. And actually, it doesn't matter. And here's why. I have older data, and for some reason, I couldn't find it the last couple of days when I was trying to recast this for tonight. This chart now shows that natural gas is our largest source of electricity generation. 10 years ago, and coal is down to 17%. 10 years ago, those two would have been reversed. Coal would have been about 40%, down from 50% 25 years ago, and natural gas would have been about 20%. I think the wind figure is wrong, but I'd have to check the data more closely. Nuclear is about right at 18%. And I'll mention two things in passing about nuclear. I hope some people are interested in the nuclear issue. One is 6 or 8 years ago, it was announced that we were going to close down Diablo Canyon, our last nuclear power plant. And even though, as I mentioned before, it produced 10% of our total electricity in California, that one plant, 24/7 it can run. And Governor Newsom changed his mind and decided we need to keep it open. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to keep it open for probably another 20 years or longer. And then about 6 or 8 weeks ago, Secretary of Energy Granholm went down to Georgia to open up the first major nuclear power plant the United States has built in more than 30 years, maybe closer to 40 years, with the Vogtle 2 in Georgia. It's a huge, I think, 3,000 megawatt nuclear plant. It ran way over budget, took twice as long to build. This is the problem in nuclear, is it's always expensive and it's always a problem. But she said the United States needs to triple the number of nuclear power plants that it has. And we need to think about reopening some ones we've closed down. These are astonishing things to hear from any administration, but especially a Democratic administration, I think. And if they mean that, it means that the so-called nuclear renaissance we keep hearing about may be about to take place. So I mentioned that this chart would look all different if you took a chart from 10 years ago and 20 years ago. Here's a different graphical illustration of what has happened over those years, so you don't have to do one pie chart after. You can see that natural gas has grown to be our largest source of power generation. Renewables. Now, renewables, we think these days of wind and solar, but the largest share of renewables actually is hydropower. And we don't build many dams anymore. And if somebody wants to look into, hydropower, why we quit building it. Environmentalists don't want to see rivers disrupted and so forth. And I understand that. And there's some problems with dams. They have a lot of silt buildup behind them over time that makes them less and less efficient and so forth. But still, hydro is possibly an underutilized zero source of electricity. And there you can see coal going from a really the dominant source down to now one of our more minor sources. Okay. I'm going to skip over because we're running on time and I want to leave some time for any questions or comments. The whole question of energy subsidies is important. And this data is actually out of date by 6-7 years. But I want to talk about subsidies versus power output, but what rates have changed over time. The big story, and here's some very recent data, is President Biden and Congress passed, they're called the Inflation Reduction Act, but President Biden here just in the last week or two admitted that really it was a climate bill and an energy bill. We just threw inflation on there because people were worked up about it, and that's politics. And what you can see is the existing energy subsidies for things like wind and solar, but also some other forms of energy, are in the orange bars at the bottom, look pretty low compared to what is being provided by the Inflation Reduction Act energy subsidies and tax credits, which are huge. I mean, you call it the Big Bang or the blowout to end all blowout subsidy bills. And we're going to see what we get from it. What I mean by that is, we're going to get a lot of new capacity built. Is it going to lower our emissions trajectory? That's an interesting question. That's not simple. And is it going to actually replace reliable sources, or are we still going to have the intermittency problems, especially if we don't expand our grid? And I'm going to skip over that problem for the moment because it's complicated and takes a while to get into, but it's a very live issue right now in Congress and elsewhere and in the states. Now, energy demand in the United States has been flat or even slightly falling for almost 40 years now. Even our economy, we have been getting more energy efficient at a consistent rate of about 1.5% a year for a very long time now. And so our overall energy demand has been flat. Now, lots of changes inside it, as you've already, I think, gathered by the different energy mixes we have and so forth. But we're now expecting an energy demand, especially electricity demand, and start rising very substantially again. And one of them is, one of the objects of current climate policy is to electrify as many things as possible. That's why the push for electric cars and buses. But what's coming at us in addition to much higher demand for electricity to charge batteries and make batteries, what we now have, and I'm sure some of you have heard about this, the expansion of artificial intelligence, which, I don't know if it's going to mean robots that eat us up like the Terminator or not, but those data centers for artificial intelligence, which we expect to expand rapidly, are huge energy users, meaning electricity consumers. And never mind the electric cars and electric trucks and so forth, the data centers, and by the way, the existing data centers for things you get through Google and Amazon and Twitter and all the rest are huge energy hogs already. And it's going to grow really fast. So we're going to be putting huge demands on our electricity grids and energy supplies in the future. This is one way of thinking about it. Here's another extrapolation by McKinsey put in the Washington Post. And so this is expected demand of electricity for energy data centers alone through the end of this decade. So you can see it's going to about double. And so that represents a major challenge. Now, what's important for cars, if you're going to replace gasoline and diesel and fuels you can store in your car for mobility and refuel easily along the road, if you're going to do that with batteries or electricity, you need a lot of batteries. And oh, is that an interesting and complicated subject? Batteries require a lot of copper, and we're already looking at huge shortages in copper starting very soon. I've seen one estimate by an analyst for the government of Finland named Simon Michaud, and I will share his work in the fullness of time. He has calculated, and I think he really knows what he's doing, although we might want to replicate his work. He has calculated that over the next 30 years, if we're going to build all the battery storage we want, the world will have to mine and produce and refine more copper than we have in the entire history of the human race going back 2,000 years. So that's true. Let that sink in a bit and ask yourself if you think we're going to be able to make that many batteries and get that much copper. Maybe we can. I mean, I keep seeing lithium supply. It's rising because lithium is another one of the important inputs to batteries. But of existing copper production and the existing demand for copper for the batteries we project we're going to make already is already falling by our current estimates drastically short fairly soon. And that will be a resource constraint on the battery revolution for electrifying everything if it comes to pass. And then who has all the stuff? Well, we talked earlier about we didn't like being dependent on foreign oil. Well, how are we going to like being dependent on key minerals for batteries from a whole bunch of other countries, including some that don't like us, like Russia? The rest of them we can deal with, I think, like Chile and Australia, obviously. But that's another problem. And by the way, those countries are going to want to make batteries probably too. So lastly, I'll give you some of the snark about this, I suppose. I tend to downplay this a bit if I can. But global energy consumption keeps growing because it's a growing planet. Most of the rest of the world would like to live comfortable middle-class lives like America does. And what you see here is one of the discouraging aspects. You may hear that solar and wind power are growing like crazy and other renewables. There's still such a tiny share of the growing use of total global energy. One analyst I know puts it this way. If you go back again to the energy transitions of the past, from coal to oil to natural gas, away from biofuels and so forth, we're now talking about how we want to get rid of fossil fuels as soon as, and for some people, by the year 2050. And the question is, really, you're going to replace all these three guys in the space of, now we're looking at 26 years. And that's why someone says, well, magic is going to go there. We're really going to do that. And so that, by the way, is why we now use the term net zero. We didn't used to use that term. We used to actually have hard targets of, well, one of them, the one that was popular 20 years ago was called, how to go, 80 by 50. We wanted an 80% reduction in the use of coal, oil, and gas by the year 2050. We don't use those metrics anymore. We now say net zero. Well, net zero really means net zero emissions. And the asterisk there, the magic that goes there, the magic asterisk, so to speak, is, well, maybe we can keep using coal, oil, and gas. We can figure out a way to sequester the carbon sequestration, put it underground, do something with it. And that's also an excellent subject. There have been piles of studies written about carbon sequestration. There are lots of demonstration projects going on with engineers to try and figure out the technology to do it. And it's proving to be very expensive and very difficult. So worth learning about some of those challenges and what progress is and isn't being made. Lots more can be said about all of that. And our fossil fuel use keeps growing. And this is another sort of, cranky view based, this is some 4-year-old data, but we're going to take these renewable energies that are still a sliver of our total energy output, and we're going to replace these big ones. And we're going to do it fast. That's what the politicians tell us. So a dose of reality might be useful. I mentioned nuclear power. You can see that we used to build a lot of nuclear power, and then we quit, and now we're trying to get back into it. Germany, you may know, in a fit of panic, decided to close down all of its nuclear power plants. And if they'd kept their nuclear power plants, they would have reached their 2030 carbon reduction targets already. This is how foolish we were to get rid of nuclear power. And a lot of environmentalists now agree with that proposition. I mentioned oil. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. I talked about how oil production is at a record high. Our gas reserves are also at a record high. I can remember back around the year 2000, 2005, gas was about, I think it topped out at $15 a thousand cubic feet. Gas today is around $2 a thousand cubic feet, maybe $3. And that's because we're producing so much more of it through the fracking revolution. We'll talk more about that in due course. I think I will stop there. Maybe I'll give you a side gag. I use this for the environment. This is from the New Yorker a few years ago. Our air's clean, water pure, but nobody lives past 30. And it's for a whole lot of reasons, but one of them was we didn't have command of energy to make our lives better. So I'll stop there. I'm gone for almost an hour and 20 minutes. I didn't really come up for much air to invite questions or comments. Does anybody want to ask something at this point? Let me just go back to the key takeaways here. Yeah, which was this one. I want to reemphasize this. Well, let me say that I'm happy to take email questions if any of you have them. I think you have my email or can find it easy enough, and happy to try and answer them. We've barely scratched the surface of just a few things tonight, and I think a lot of things will, I won't say get easier, but I think a lot of things will crystallize better in 2 weeks when I go through energy data sources and take you through where to find them. There are several, I'll just mention now, I'll do this later, don't worry about trying to write this down now, but there's the International Energy Agency, there's our own Energy Information Administration here in our Department of Energy that has an exhaustive and exhausting website of data. The EPA has some great data in certain places. There's also some private sector people that track data. There's the Energy Institute in London that does the statistical review of world energy every June. That's absolutely fabulous. There's a research outfit at Oxford University called Our World in Data, run by a guy named Max Roser, who I know a little bit, and I actually had one of his charts earlier in this presentation. And I will acquaint you with all their sites, and also with a couple of there are a couple of websites there where you can. One's called Gapminder. I'll just mention the name now, but I'll show it to you. And it's a wonderful site for picking out different sets of data you want to relate and setting in motion if you want to make motion graphics, but showing their relation on two axes between one variable and another. And so you can play with the data endlessly and find out answers to some very interesting and specific questions that are very useful for your research. But with that, I'll stop talking for a minute and take a breath if anyone wants to take a breath and ask a question. Otherwise, if you're all happy, maybe if you're all happy tonight, just remember the first three things I want you to take away on energy is density, cost, and scale. If you get those down, you're halfway on the road to becoming a energy ninja. Well, if not, then I think what I'll do, I know what I'll do. I'll turn it off and say hi again. Now I can see myself. Well, if not, then if no one wants to ask a question, I think then in that case, I might say good night from Oslo, Norway, where they produce a lot of oil and gas. So,